Martha lived a life that was measured by the rising sun and the setting moon, not by the ticking of a clock. At 45 years old, she was a woman of the soil. Her home was a sprawling, noisy dairy farm located on the outskirts of a quiet village called Oakhaven. To anyone passing by on the main road, Martha was just a background character in the landscape. People saw her in oversized overalls driving a heavy tractor through the mud, or they saw her at the Saturday market with a smear of dirt on her cheek and a box of fresh eggs in her hands. To the world, she was simply the farmer's wife. Her days were a cycle of hard, unending work. She was up before the sun to feed the calves, spent hours in the milking sheds, and finished her days balancing the farm accounts by the weak light of a kitchen lamp. But despite the aching in her back and the constant tiredness in her bones, Martha carried a secret that burned bright inside her, deep inside the old farmhouse. Sitting in a corner of the living room that smelled of wood polish and stews was a battered, second-hand upright piano. It wasn't a shiny, new instrument. The finish was scratched in places, and one of the pedals squeaked if you pressed it too hard. Her husband, a quiet man named Thomas, who loved her deeply, had bought it for her years ago as an anniversary surprise. He knew she used to play, but he didn't know the full extent of it. This dusty piano was Martha's sanctuary. Every single evening after the heavy work was done and the farmhouse grew quiet, Martha would sit down on the bench. She would gently wipe the dust from the keys with the hem of her sleeve, place her rough, calloused fingers on the ivory, and begin to play. The transformation was instant. When her hands touched the keys, Martha wasn't a tired farmer anymore. She was a master. She played complex classical pieces, with a skill and emotion that seemed impossible for someone who spent her day hauling hay. Her fingers, usually stained with earth, moved with a speed and grace that could make you cry. She played Beethoven, Chopin, and Mozart with a passion that she kept locked away from the rest of the world. It was her escape, a beautiful secret life that existed only in the dim light of her living room, hidden behind the humble face of a woman in work boots. The annual Oakhaven Charity Gala was the biggest event of the year for the village, a night when everyone dusted off their best clothes and came together to raise money for the local hospital. For weeks, the talk of the town had been the special musical guest, a pianist imported all the way from the city, who was rumored to be famous, Mrs. Higgins. The woman in charge of the event had been running on pure adrenaline and coffee, trying to make sure every detail was perfect. She had booked a town hall, arranged for fresh flowers, and organized a caterer. The future of the gala looked bright until the disaster struck. Just 3 days before the event, the phone call came. The pianist had fallen ill with a severe flu and would not be able to travel, let alone perform. Mrs. Higgins was devastated. She scrambled to call other musicians in nearby towns, but it was too short notice. Everyone was already booked, or the price was far too high for a small charity event. The panic set in deep. She was walking around the village with a wrinkled brow and a notebook clutched to her chest, wondering how she was going to break the news to the 200 people who had already bought tickets. It was by pure chance that she found herself standing in line at the post office behind Martha. The post office was warm and smelled of old paper and stamps. Martha was there to mail a package of seeds to a cousin. While she waited, she was staring out the window, her mind miles away. Without realizing it, she began to hum very softly. It wasn't a simple hum like someone whistling a pop song on the radio. It was a complex, weaving melody that shifted pitch and tone. It was the tune of a difficult classical piece she had been practicing the night before. Mrs. Higgins, stressed and desperate for a solution, sharpened her ears. She knew that sound. She turned sharply and looked at Martha. The farmer's wife was wearing her thick wool coat and boots, looking like she was ready to go back out to the fields, but the sound coming from her throat was refined and elegant. "Martha," Mrs. Higgins said, tapping her on the shoulder. "What is that tune?" Martha stopped immediately, her face turning a shade of pink. She looked down at her boots, embarrassed to be caught humming in public. "Oh, nothing, really. Just something I heard on the radio years ago. It gets stuck in my head sometimes." Mrs. Higgins narrowed her eyes. She wasn't buying it. "You have a lovely pitch, Martha. You have a musician's ear. Do you play an instrument? Martha laughed nervously, shifting the package from one hand to the other. She was used to people asking about cows or corn, not music. I have a piano at the house. Thomas bought it for me a long time ago. I plink around on it sometimes to relax, but I'm certainly no performer. Just then, the heavy wooden door of the post office swung open, letting in a gust of cold wind. Thomas walked in, stomping the mud off his boots. He saw the two women talking and noticed the panicked look on Mrs. Higgins' face and the flushed look on his wife's face. He walked over, placing a gentle hand on Martha's back. "Everything okay here?" Thomas asked, his voice deep and steady. Mrs. Higgins jumped at the chance. "Thomas, tell your wife she is being modest. I think she could play for us." Martha's eyes went wide. She shook her head quickly. "Oh no, Mrs. Higgins, no. I couldn't. I just play for fun. My hands are too stiff. It's been years." Thomas looked at his wife. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of being seen as something other than what she was. But he also knew the truth. He had sat in the other room listening to her pour her heart into that piano for decades. He knew she had a gift that the world deserved to hear, even if she was too afraid to show it. "She's being too humble, Mrs. Higgins," Thomas said, a smile spreading across his face. "She plays every evening. She plays better than anyone I've ever heard on the wireless. If you ask me, she's the only one in this village who could save that gala of yours." Martha looked at her husband with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "Thomas, hush," she whispered, but Mrs. Higgins didn't hush. She saw a lifeline, a solution to her disaster. She grabbed Martha's rough hands in her own smooth ones. "Martha, please. We are desperate. The main act canceled. We need someone. Just a few pieces. It would mean the world to the charity." The pressure weighed on Martha. She looked at Mrs. Higgins, who looked ready to cry from stress, and then at Thomas, whose eyes were full of warm encouragement. She knew how important the charity was to the hospital. She knew the town was counting on the event. "Okay," Martha said quietly, the word barely leaving her throat. "I will do it. But I'm not a professional. Please don't tell people to expect a show." Mrs. Higgins let out a breath that seemed to deflate her entire body. "Oh, thank you. Thank you, Martha. You are saving the day." They left the post office, and Martha walked back to the truck in a daze. As Thomas started the engine, the reality of what she had just agreed to began to sink in. She wasn't nervous about playing the notes. She knew she could play them. She was nervous about who was watching. She was terrified of walking onto that stage in her nice dress, looking like the farmer's wife they all knew, and then revealing the deepest, most hidden part of her soul. She feared they wouldn't believe her, or worse, they would laugh at the thought of a dairy farmer trying to be an artist. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Every time Martha sat down at the piano to practice, her fingers felt heavy. The dusty living room felt different now. It felt like a rehearsal room instead of a sanctuary. She looked at her hands, the hands that mucked out stalls and chopped wood, and wondered how they could create something beautiful. The imposter syndrome sat heavy on her shoulders. She was just Martha, the farmer's wife. She wasn't ready to be Martha, the pianist. But the promise was made and the date was set. There was no turning back now. The evening of the Oak Haven Charity Gala finally arrived, turning the usually quiet village into a bustle of excitement. The old town hall, which normally hosted town meetings and bingo nights, had been completely transformed. Volunteers had spent the entire day hanging streamers and polishing the worn wooden floorboards until they shone like mirrors. Heavy velvet curtains were pulled across the stage, and the air inside was thick with the smell of roast chicken, expensive perfume, and the heat of too many bodies crammed into one room. Martha stood near the back entrance, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop she couldn't come back from. Beside her, Thomas adjusted his tie. He was wearing a suit that was a little too tight around the shoulders, the same one he hadn't worn since their daughter's wedding 5 years ago. He looked nervous, but not for himself. He kept glancing at Martha, his eyes full of a quiet, fierce pride. "You look beautiful, Martha," he said softly, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Martha looked down at herself. She was wearing her best Sunday dress, a simple navy blue number with a small white flower pinned to the collar. It was clean, it was pressed, but to Martha it felt like a costume. She felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Her shoes were polished, but they were the same sturdy low heels she wore to church, not the delicate slippers the other women were wearing. She felt rough, unpolished, and completely out of place among the silk and satin of the town's elite. "I feel like a fraud, Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at them. They are waiting for a show. They are expecting a professional. I just milk cows and feed chickens." Thomas shook his head firmly. "You are a musician. You have more talent in your little finger than half the people in this room have in their whole bodies. Just close your eyes and play like you do in the living room. Pretend I'm the only one here." Martha took a deep breath, trying to steady the racing of her heart. She wanted to believe him, but the atmosphere in the hall was intimidating. The room was packed with local dignitaries, wealthy landowners from neighboring towns, and farmers who had traded their overalls for suits. They were all sipping wine, laughing loudly, and chatting about the upcoming harvest or the price of grain. As the hour for the performance approached, the guests began to migrate toward the rows of chairs set up in front of the stage. There was a low buzz of conversation. People were asking where the famous pianist from the city was. They were confused. When Mrs. Higgins walked onto the stage to tap the microphone, the room went quiet, but it was an impatient sort of quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Higgins began, her voice shaking slightly. "As you know, we had a terrible change of plans for tonight. But I am delighted to tell you that we have found talent right here in our own backyard. Please welcome our very own Martha, who has graciously agreed to play for us tonight." A polite ripple of applause went through the crowd. It wasn't the roar of excitement one might expect for a star. It was the sound of a village being nice. Martha saw people looking around with raised eyebrows. She saw the local baker whispering to his wife. She saw a young man in an expensive suit checking his watch. They were expecting a simple folk song. They were expecting a shy, amateurish rendition of Chopsticks or Silent Night. They were ready to endure a few minutes of mediocrity because it was for charity, and then get back to their drinks. Martha's legs felt heavy as lead as she walked toward the stage. The distance from the back of the room to the stairs felt like a mile. Every step was an effort. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her back. She felt exposed. She wasn't hidden behind the wheel of a tractor or obscured by a market stall. She was in the light. As she climbed the stairs, the squeak of her shoe on the wood seemed deafening in the quiet hall. She walked to the center of the stage where the grand piano stood. It was a beautiful instrument, much bigger and newer than her upright at home. It looked black and shiny like a sleek car. For a second, Martha felt a wave of terror wash over her. What if her fingers were too stiff? What if she forgot the notes? What if she humiliated herself and Thomas? She sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold. She adjusted the skirt of her dress, trying to cover her knees, feeling painfully modest. The lights from the ceiling were bright, making it hard to see the audience clearly, which was a blessing. She took a moment to flex her fingers. They looked so strange in the spotlight, skin tanned from the sun, knuckles slightly swollen from years of manual labor, nails cut short for practicality. These were not the hands of a concert pianist. From where she sat, she could hear the faint sounds of the city outside, a car horn, a dog barking. It reminded her of home. She closed her eyes for a brief second and imagined she was back in her own living room. She imagined the smell of the stew cooking on the stove and the sound of the rain on the roof. She let out a long, slow breath and let her hands hover over the keys. The audience shuffled in their seats. A few people coughed. A glass clinked in the back. The silence was heavy, waiting, almost judgmental. They were settled in, ready to be polite. They had no idea that the woman sitting before them was about to tear down every assumption they had ever made about her. Martha opened her eyes, stared at the black and white keys, and prepared to let her soul speak for her. Martha didn't wait for the murmurs in the crowd to completely fade away. She knew that if she sat there thinking about it for even one more second, her courage would crumble like a dry cookie. She took a sharp, deep breath and placed her rough, worn fingers on the keys. Without giving herself time to panic, she brought her hands down for the first chords. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't the polite, gentle tinkling everyone expected. It was a thunderous, deep roar that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's prelude in C-sharp minor hit the room like a physical force. In the front row, the mayor actually jumped in his seat, nearly spilling his glass of water. The people who were still whispering in the back stopped instantly, their heads snapping toward the stage in shock. The contrast was impossible to ignore. There sat this modest woman in a simple blue dress, looking small and fragile against the massive black piano. Yet the sound coming from the instrument was huge, aggressive, and full of terrifying power. It sounded like a storm was trapped inside the wood, and Martha was the only one who could control it. Her left hand began to pound out the heavy, driving rhythm in the lower octaves. It was a sound that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth, steady and relentless. It wasn't hard for her to play this part. She was used to hard work. She was used to pushing against things that resisted. The force of her left hand was natural to her, born from years of pushing plows and carrying heavy feed bags. Then her right hand began to move. This was where the magic happened. The fingers that were usually stained with dirt and rough from manual labor moved with a blinding speed that didn't look real. They danced across the high keys, creating a cascade of sound that was like rain falling on a tin roof. Fast and rhythmic and beautiful dot from the very first measure, the room went completely silent. You could literally hear a pin drop. The silence was heavy and thick. 200 people held their breath at the same time. The young man in the expensive suit who had been checking his watch froze, his arms still raised in midair, his mouth hanging open slightly. The baker stopped chewing his food. The elderly teacher in the back row adjusted her glasses, leaning forward as if she couldn't trust her own ears. Martha didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed. In her mind, she wasn't in a town hall. She was back in her field, standing in the wind. She was pouring every ounce of her life into the music. She played the frustration of the years when the rain wouldn't come. She played the exhaustion of the long winter nights. She played the fierce, burning love she had for her family and her land. The music was no longer just notes on a page. It was her voice, screaming and singing all at once. The piece was difficult, incredibly difficult. It required a strength that most amateur players just didn't have. But Martha played it with an easy kind of power. She attacked the keys when the music called for anger, and then, just seconds later, her touch would become so light it felt like a feather. Brushing against the soul, there was a moment in the middle of the song where the music shifted. The heavy, crashing chords stopped and a soft, weeping melody took over. It was heartbreakingly sad. The sound drifted through the hall like a mist. It was so quiet, yet it carried so much weight. People in the audience felt a lump form in their throats. They weren't just listening to a song. They were feeling a profound sadness that they all recognized but rarely spoke about. It was the sound of hard labor, of sacrifice, of things endured without complaint. Martha's face was peaceful, but her body was swaying slightly, caught in the current of the music. The stage lights caught the silver in her hair and made her look almost angelic, yet her hands struck the keys with the force of a hammer. It was a beautiful contradiction. The people in the chairs forgot she was the farmer's wife. They forgot she was the woman who sold them eggs. They only saw the music. They saw a woman who had mastered a language they didn't know she spoke. As the piece built toward its climax, the tempo increased again. The notes came faster and faster, a whirlwind of sound that made the air vibrate. Her hands were crossing over each other, leaping up and down the keyboard. It looked athletic, almost like a sport. The tension in the room was incredible. People were leaning forward in their seats, captivated, unable to look away. They were witnessing something that didn't happen in Oak Haven every day. They were witnessing a transformation. The sound grew louder and louder, filling every corner of the hall. It drowned out the ticking of the clock on the wall. It drowned out the thoughts in everyone's heads. There was only the music. Martha was playing with a ferocity that startled everyone, including herself. She wasn't holding anything back. She was giving them everything she had, pouring her heart out through her fingertips. She wasn't thinking about the dress she was wearing or the mud on her boots anymore. She wasn't worried about what they would say when she walked off the stage. She was free. For these few minutes, she wasn't defined by the farm or the laundry or the bills. She was defined by the beauty she was creating. And as she approached the final crashing chords, she knew she had done the one thing she always wanted to do. She had truly spoken. As the music reached its final peak, Martha struck the last chords with a force that seemed to lift her right off the piano bench. It was a thunderous, crashing finale that shook the floorboards and echoed off the high ceiling of the town hall. For a split second, the sound hung in the air like a heavy cloud, vibrating through the walls and the bones of everyone sitting there. Then, Martha pulled her hands away from the keys. She didn't jump up immediately to take a bow. She sat there, shoulders rising and falling with her deep breaths, staring at the black and white keys as if she were surprised they were still there. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could hear it in her ears. The adrenaline was rushing through her, making her fingers tingle, but what happened next was something Martha would never forget. It wasn't the sound of applause. It was the sound of nothing. The hall was plunged into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when something truly miraculous occurs, when people are so stunned that their brains stop working for a moment. No one moved. The mayor had completely forgotten the glass of water in his hand. The baker had stopped chewing. The young man in the expensive suit was frozen with his mouth slightly open, his watch completely forgotten. 200 people were holding their breath at the same time. They weren't just being polite anymore. They were processing what they had just seen and heard. The contrast was still ringing in their ears, the rough hands of the woman they saw every day. The woman who bought flour and chatted about the weather had just produced a sound of breathtaking, professional beauty. They realized they had never truly known her. They realized they had judged a book by its cover, and now the book had revealed a treasure inside. The silence lasted for 10 seconds. Maybe 15. To Martha, it felt like an hour. A cold spike of fear went through her chest. They hate it, she thought. Asterisk, I was too loud. I was too much. I've made a fool of myself. Asterisk, she started to lower her head, her face burning with shame, preparing to stand up and walk off the stage in disgrace. Then, a single clap came from the back of the room. It was Mrs. Higgins. She was standing near the exit, tears streaming down her face, clapping her hands together with all her might. That one sound broke the spell. Suddenly the room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. It started as a wave of noise and grew instantly into a thunderous ovation. People jumped to their feet. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone whistled loudly from the balcony. Martha flinched at the sudden noise, startled. She looked up, blinking in the bright lights, and saw a sea of people standing. They were smiling, they were cheering, and many of them were wiping tears from their eyes. They weren't looking at her with pity or amusement anymore. They were looking at her with respect. Slowly, clumsily, Martha stood up. She felt lightheaded. She smoothed down her blue skirt and gave a small, awkward curtsy, the kind she had seen in old movies, not the formal bow of a concert artist. She didn't know what to do with her hands, so she just held them together in front of her chest. The applause got louder. She looked out into the crowd and found Thomas. He was standing right in the front row, clapping harder than anyone, his face beaming with a smile so wide it looked like it might crack. He wasn't surprised. He was just happy that finally everyone else could see what he saw every night. Martha couldn't speak. She didn't have a speech prepared. She just nodded once, a quick, nervous nod of thanks, and turned to walk off the stage. As she stepped into the wings, away from the blinding lights, the cool air of the backstage hit her. Her legs felt like jelly, and she had to lean against the wall for a moment to keep from falling. Mrs. Higgins rushed over, grabbing her hands. Martha, that was incredible. I had no idea. Nobody had any idea. Martha smiled shyly, the color still high in her cheeks. I was just happy to help, she whispered. I think I need to go sit down now. Thomas was waiting for her just outside the curtain. He didn't say anything at first. He just opened his arms and hugged her. Martha buried her face in his rough jacket, smelling the familiar scent of hay and earth that always clung to him. In that moment, she wasn't a musician or a star. She was just his wife, and she was safe. You did good, Martha, Thomas said softly, kissing the top of her head. You showed them. They didn't stay for the rest of the gala. Martha didn't want to answer questions or hear people tell her how talented she was. She didn't want the spotlight. She just wanted to go home. They slipped out the back door while the guests were still buzzing about the performance, walking hand in hand through the cool night air to their old truck. The drive back to the farm was quiet. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. The moon was high in the sky, illuminating the fields of corn and wheat that Martha worked so hard to tend. The world looked the same as it had that morning, but Martha felt different. She felt like a weight she had been carrying for years had been lifted when they pulled into the driveway. The dogs barked a greeting, and the familiar creak of the farmhouse door welcomed them. Martha walked inside and hung up her good dress. She washed her face and put on her old, comfortable nightgown. She went into the living room and sat down on the bench of her old, upright piano. The house was dark and quiet again. The audience was gone. The applause had faded away. It was just her and the piano, the way it had always been. But as she placed her hands on the keys, she realized that the fear was gone. She didn't need the city people to tell her she was good, and she didn't need to hide her talent anymore. She knew who she was. She played a soft, gentle lullaby, just for herself in the sleeping house. The music floated out the window and over the farm, mingling with the sounds of the crickets and the wind. Martha smiled, closed her eyes, and let the music carry her to sleep. She was still the farmer's wife, but now she was also something else. She was complete.